I mentioned last lecture, when discussing the Phoenicians, how the invasions of the Sea Peoples allowed for the creation and existence of smaller kingdoms for a brief window of Near Eastern history. Another of these kingdoms, which would ultimately be caught between the clash of empires and eventually destroyed by them, are the kingdoms of the Hebrews. Politically speaking, the Hebrews would not merit an entire lecture for themselves, but their spiritual legacy of strict monotheism survived their political state and has now become a defining feature of Western civilization. The religion of the Hebrews would later be known as Judaism, and there are millions of followers of Judaism known as the Jews today, and there are billions of Christians whose movement began as a reform movement within the Hebrew tradition. The Hebrew people claim descent from Abraham, a Sumerian who lived in the city of Ur. He is the first of the followers of the Jewish faith, and so is known as one of the patriarchs. According to the book of Genesis, Abraham was instructed by Yahweh, the name of the Jewish God, to leave his home and migrate with his people to a promised land, which would be called Canaan. This migration probably took place sometime between 2000 and 1500 BC. Abraham had a son, Isaac, who had another son, Jacob, who had 12 sons. Jacob would later change his name to Israel, and with some minor adjustments, these 12 sons would become the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. Sometime early in their history, these Hebrews migrated to Egypt to serve as laborers and were ultimately enslaved. According to the book of Exodus, the Hebrews were eventually liberated by the lawgiver, Moses, probably around 1275 BC. They then returned to Canaan, where Abraham had dwelt. Abraham's household had been rather small, and they were one group of people who lived in Canaan. When the Hebrews returned, their land was therefore occupied by other Canaanites. The Exodus probably occurred at the same time as the Sea People invasion, and one of the groups of Sea Peoples had also settled in Canaan, a group known as the Philistines. These Philistines, who settled in what is today the Gaza Strip, lend their name to the present region. Palestine is a Latin derivation of Philistine. To gain land to live off of, the Hebrews fought the Canaanites and the Philistines for several generations. Eventually, the 12 tribes united under a single monarch to fight more efficiently, a man named Saul. Saul was succeeded by his son-in-law, David, who captured the city of Jerusalem to be his capital, and secured the borders of what became known as the Kingdom of Israel. David was succeeded by his son Solomon, who built a magnificently rich temple to Yahweh in Jerusalem. This, combined with other building projects, led to high taxes and an increasingly unsettled population. At the death of Solomon, his kingdom was divided. 10 tribes seceded in the north to form the Kingdom of Israel, while the 2 southern tribes remained under Solomon's son and became known as the Kingdom of Judah. One of the core identifying features of the Hebrew people has always been their religion. Abraham's authority, after all, was based on his relationship to Yahweh, who called him out of Ur. Over time, the Hebrews accepted Yahweh as their only God, establishing a monotheistic faith. It seems that at first, the Hebrews accepted Yahweh as the only divinity that they would worship, and the relationship they formed became known as the covenant. The language that the Hebrews used to describe their loyalty to Yahweh is similar to that used by other Near Eastern peoples when they entered into formal contractual agreements. Some historians have speculated that the Hebrews may have learned about monotheism from Akhenaten, but it does need to be pointed out that the Hebrews did not establish their covenant with Yahweh until centuries later when they left Egypt and were traveling to Canaan. They made this covenant on Mount Sinai, where they accepted the 10 Commandments. The first of these is the acceptance of the exclusive worship of Yahweh. This should not imply that the Hebrews did a good job at monotheism. They found it difficult to resist some of the Canaanite gods they encountered in the Promised Land. In fact, much of the Bible discusses the Hebrews' unfaithfulness, along with the resistance to those who tried to get them to abandon polytheism, and these people were known as prophets. They came from a variety of social backgrounds, but felt divinely inspired to remind the Hebrews of their covenant. According to the accounts of these prophets, the history of the Hebrews was wrapped up in their loyalty to Yahweh. Whenever the people broke the covenant through polytheism or moral failures, Yahweh punished the people through misfortunes, such as foreign invasion. Hebrew kings sometimes persecuted these prophets, although the prophets were occasionally able to change the minds, even of kings. The prophets set a precedent of connecting the spiritual and the political sources of authority, which would be important for the later development of Western civilization. For example, medieval popes would oppose kings and emperors, often citing the example of the ancient Hebrew prophets. one of the key features of the prophet's exhortations was social justice. In the 700s BC, the kingdoms of Israel began to urbanize and left many of the agricultural lives of their ancestors behind. This resulted in an economic transformation that was not anticipated in the earliest Hebrew laws. City occupations usually create wealth for some more than others, leading to an uneven distribution. Some get wealthy, others fall into poverty. Often, this is the direct result of the exploitation of the poorer people in society by the wealthy. The book of Amos is interested in preaching that the Hebrew people will be ruined by this economic exploitation unless they repent. The disaster predicted by Amos came to realization in 721, when the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern 10 tribes of the Kingdom of Israel. Judah survived, but as a client state to Assyria. To those who believed that God ordered history, this appeared to be the punishment of Israel predicted by their abandonment of the exclusive worship of Yahweh. Judah had committed sins of social injustice, but had officially maintained a monotheistic faith, and this was used to explain the lesser punishment meted out to them. As previously mentioned, the identity of the 10 tribes of Israel disappeared as a result of the Assyrian deportation policy, further confirmation of their punishment for abandoning their faith. A cultural aspect of monotheism also becomes evident as a result of the assimilation of these Israelites. The Hebrews were set apart by the monotheism. By adopting polytheistic ways, there wasn't enough to differentiate the Israelites from their Assyrian neighbors, and they quickly disappeared as a unique people. Judah, however, maintained its religious identity, even after they were defeated and deported in 586 by the Chaldeans under Nebuchadnezzar. As a result, they preserved their identity in exile. It is actually from the period of the Babylonian captivity that the Hebrews began to be known as Jews, and the land of Judah as Judea. The Babylonian captivity was not long. As previously discussed, the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem by Cyrus of Persia. Specifically, the Jews were allowed to return in order to rebuild their temple, which the Chaldeans had destroyed. While in exile, the Jews had entered a new phase of religious awareness, and now believed that their mission was to make monotheism known to the whole world. The Jews didn't send out missionaries, but rather lived a distinctive sort of life that was to highlight the differences between their lifestyle and that of the rest of the world. This globalizing idea will be picked up by Christians, who actively sought to preach their beliefs to the world and convert pagans. Although the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem, not all chose to do so. This began the period of the diaspora, which means dispersion. The diaspora refers to those Jews who continued to maintain their Jewish identity, but didn't live in Judea. Jewish communities would thrive in Hellenistic Alexandria and many cities of the Roman Empire.